What's up, everybody? I'm going to start off with this because I never get a chance to talk about it. Did you know that the Dalai Lama is supposed to be the same person over and over again? The first time was at the end of the 14th century, and now he is the 14th reincarnation of the same soul. So, how do they know how to find him every time? Well, they start off looking for a child that was born around the right date. I think according to the Tibetan Book of the Dead that you spend about 40 days in the bardos and then you enter into a new fetus. So if the soul enters the new fetus early in gestation, then I guess it's 9 months, 40 days, which I just thought of that. We should ask them at what point does the soul enter the body and settle this debate once and for all. Sidetrack much? So they look for a child that's been born within the right time frame, and then they put a number of items in front of the potential children, and one of them is sentimental to the old Dalai Lama, or a couple of them, and the kid will gravitate towards those if he's the right one. If that doesn't work, they go to this lake here and pray and usually get a vision of how to find him. But here's the deal, is they only search around for him in Tibet. So if that's true, then that would mean that you reincarnate physically close to where you perished, right? I mean, it does kind of make a little bit of cosmic sense. Theoretically, you could reincarnate into the same bloodline every time, or just as friends, pets, farm animals, which some people do believe. But I thought that was an interesting concept that you reincarnate locally. And this is supposed to be the 14th reincarnation of the Dalai Lama, so that would pretty well have to be the case. It'd be kind of hard to find if he popped up in Brazil the next time and then Canada after that, you know? Another thought I have on this is I wonder if the time you spend in gestation in a fetus is what would cause your memory swipe. You get into a new body and it's nice and warm and comfortable and you take a 9-month nap. Then you pop out and it's cold and you go, man, I was sleeping good. I just want to go back to sleep. Who knows? So one thought I had about the fourth turning is, what if it's the same generations that keep reincarnating over and over again? I find the fourth turning an interesting concept, but I would definitely make some revisions to the four turnings, the four generations. But it's a concept of cyclical time where you have four generational archetypes, where the characteristics of one generation inevitably lead to the characteristics of the next generation. So the prophet generation is born during a high, the first turning. A nomad generation is born during an awakening, the second turning. A hero generation is born during an unraveling, the third turning. An artist generation is born during a crisis, the fourth turning. Now, this was written in 1997, and I'm sorry, but it's funny to listen to millennials talk about this.
But the millennials, raised during the unraveling, will emerge as the hero generation during this crisis.
Sorry. If the millennials are the hero generation, we're screwed. They're the everybody gets a trophy generation. No, it doesn't matter that little Tommy practices basketball for 4 hours a night, or that Jenny spent 2 weeks writing her book report while you sit around playing Minecraft all day. You deserve just as much success as them because you're special. And well, he kind of proves my point here by categorizing 1943 to 1960 as the boomer generation, 1961 to 1981, Gen X. Sorry, but I'm Gen X, and people that were born in 1961 grew up in a completely different world than we did. So I like the concept, but you definitely got the dates off here. But the general idea is that each generation is approximately 20 years, and there's 4 of them equaling 80 years, which is about the average lifespan of a human. So it's not just off the wall crazy to ask, well, is it the same generations getting reincarnated over and over every 80 years? With the last turning or generation being the crisis generation, or you could say the fighting generation, because about every 80 years a major conflict breaks out. The last 3 in America, anyway, was the American Revolution, the Civil War, and then the Great Depression and World War II. Then this starts the cycle all over again with the first turning. The high. This is a post-crisis, upbeat era where institutions and communities strengthen while individualism weakens. The most recent case was the American high post-World War II. Looking back on it, the 40s and 50s seem like a very naive time to us now. World War II was the basis of our modern day mythology, basically. It's like our Trojan War. And everybody thought, well, we beat the bad guys, so now we can all just get along and we're good little Americans. We've even got the television to tell us how safe and protected we are. And there could never be anything as bad as the Germansies here in our backyard. Then there's the second turning, the awakening. This is a period of spiritual upheaval with current value systems under attack by a new values regime. The most recent case was the conscious revolution stretching from the mid-60s to the early 80s. And, this is pretty well where I think this guy's timeline got off, because it wasn't the people that were born in 1960 that experienced the 60s. But yeah, the 60s saw the rebellious generation. Their parents were all conformists. Why can't you just be like your brother Doug? But to be honest, that whole awakening got hijacked by the comrades and people that own things like record labels. And all of this pop culture really promoted the idea of chemical use and sexual liberation. I heard a really good lecture about that one time, because the original comrade movement was about class struggle, but since they didn't really have a big class disparity in America, everybody already had freedom and equality, so they had to find new lines to divide people on. So why not classify everybody by whatever kinky fetish they have? Which has really been revitalized the last 10 years or so. It wasn't like that in the 80s and 90s. Even though every movie had the obligatory hump scene, we were actually quite modest through those times, for the most part. Then the third turning, unraveling. A less upbeat era of strengthening individualism and weakening institutions, with a new value system emerging. The most recent case was the culture wars, which began with Reagan's mid-1980s and continued at the time of the writing of this book. Now, I would definitely say that the generational cutoff between the awakening and the unraveling generation was Vietnam, because the awakening generation was afraid that they'd be drafted and sent overseas. So that's one extreme, having to go to Vietnam. And then on the other extreme was the let's all go live together in the woods and grow our own smoke. So that all ended in 77, and then in the 80s, they didn't have to worry about going into a meat grinder after high school. So business-oriented on one side, flashy, hair bands, glam rock. Pop culture definitely shifted at the end of the 90s, and those people that meddle in a lot of things and own record labels decided they wanted to make the world a darker place, and you got into like Alice in Chains and Nirvana, the whole grunge scene. So I guess we were the unraveling. The fourth turning, crisis. A decisive era of crisis and climax where the values regime results in the replacement of the old civic order with a new one. The last case at the time of the book's writing was from the Great Crash of 1929. This was written in 97, so he could only go off of the last fourth turning, but we'll compare the millennials to that fourth turning last time here in a minute. His assessment of the world in 97 was, where we once thought ourselves collectively strong, we now regard ourselves as individually entitled. Yet even while we exalt our own personal growth, we realize that millions of self-actualized persons don't add up to an actualized society. Individually focused yet collectively adrift, we wonder if we're heading towards a waterfall. That is beautifully put. Here's where I think society has gone astray basically every time. When everyone puts the self before the community, then it's obviously going to weaken the community. And there are people that know this and exploit it. What was the motto for the French Revolution? Liberty, equality, fraternity, or die. Sound familiar? That's actually the Free Bricklayers' contribution to society. But these are all noble principles that we all look at and say, well, of course, that's how it should be. But is it? Well, for some, this has worked out great. Beachfront mansion, Maseratis. But for a lot of other people, it's not going so well. And many more of these than the beachfront mansions. In a society that truly put the whole community first, you wouldn't have any of this, but you also wouldn't have the beachfront mansions. But if you ask me, you need a little bit of both. It's just hard to get a balance there, and nobody ever has, apparently. But put in the context of the fourth turning, we keep going through these cycles and shifting from one end to the other. So you have a crisis, and then you have a unification, tight community bond. Everything is kind of structured and mechanical. That would be the high. Then the awakening. Well, the previous generation has all of the nuts and bolts of society put together, so then they're more artistic and more liberal about things. The previous generation was strong and disciplined, and this made for a good world for them to come up in, safe. So now they're going to start pushing the cultural norms and boundaries, because theoretically we can always be doing better. So they start trying to change things and make it into this utopic society. Well, 20 years of changing everything from a structured order to this new liberal order, and a few failed social experiments, everybody's getting very individualistic. Then comes the unraveling. And I think for Gen X, it was kind of the what the F is all this about anyway generation. We weren't quite as sure that we're going to grow up and go get a good job and live the American dream. What's the American dream anyway? It looks like some people are doing really good at this, others doing really bad. And then society gets even more individualistic. So when the crisis generation comes along, they're just completely lost, looking around saying, okay, you guys have screwed this all up. We don't stand a chance. So we might as well party and have fun if we can. And that's how I would define the crisis generation. Go back 100 years and you've got the roaring 20s. Well, I would say that that's the same generation as the millennials. And by the way, lifespans increased a lot in the last 100 years due to medicines and all that. So it takes a little bit longer for the generations to cycle through. But this was the last generation before the big stock market crash, Great Depression, World War II. And that era really reminds me a lot of the last 10 or 15 years. So they were living it up, partied their way right into the Great Depression. Let's start back at the last crisis cycle. 1860, you got the Civil War. So that sets the stage for the high generation. Well, post-Civil War was the real boom of the Industrial Revolution. So that does actually line up with the post-World War II generation. Unfortunately, they're brainwashing kids into not liking their grandparents' generation, but they're the ones that really built our modern world. There were no interstate highways prior to that. Only some people in towns had electricity, and they did a lot to build up a high-trust society. So that kind of matches up. And then the kids that are born at that time would be the next generation, or the missionary generation. And it makes sense. If you were a little kid and there was conflict all around, then you'd want to grow up and have peace, just like the peaceniks of the 60s. Only where that awakening generation got into the free love and expanding your consciousness, the previous one got into just God, trying to better the world on a spiritual basis. Then next would come the unraveling, and individuals born in 1890 belong to the lost generation, also known as the interbellum generation. So that's the Gen X generation. The what the hell are we doing here anyway generation. The name Lost Generation highlights the sense of aimlessness and disorientation experienced by those who came of age during and after World War I. So World War I was 1914, and we're back to the roaring 20s with the party generation, or what he's calling the crisis generation. So it does kind of work out. Then during the party generation crisis, everything devolves and then we fall into a big conflict. And well, the powers that be have been trying pretty hard to make that happen here lately. Succinctly put, hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. And I think it very well could be the same 4 generations reincarnating over and over again, if that's how all this works. I had one commenter all bummed out when I was talking about reincarnation one time, because then that means that there's no heaven. According to the Buddhists, there's still a heaven. There's still other realms you can move on to. But I think according to them, it's not eternal heaven. You go there and you live another lifetime in a different way, and then you pass on and keep going through samsara. But just like everybody else on Earth, I have no idea how this all works, so don't worry about what I say. Here's my really far-in theory of all that. If you read the old legends of the gods, they're tricksters. You gotta do something to fill your time with, right? Eternity's a long, long time. So in the Egyptian pantheon, Seth was jealous of his brother Osiris, and to get rid of him, he had a magnificent chest built to Osiris's exact measurements. Then they had a big party and said, whoever fits in this box wins it. So all the gods cycle through, nobody fits in it just right, and then Osiris gets in, and it's a perfect fit. And then all of a sudden, Seth and his accomplices nail the lid down shut and throw him in the ocean. So here's my totally out there theory, is that we are actually one consciousness, one God that got tricked into this realm. And we're actually just one God living all of these lives over and over. And one of these days, our buddy's going to come and pull the nails out of the lid and open it up. And we're just going to wake up and say, wow, that was a trip, dude. I've actually read that in Talmudic mysticism that all of the grays are actually just divisions of the soul of Adam. Of course, they're real men. We're not. But it's really not that far off of what I was just describing. What do I know? I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll catch you on the next one. Static out.